Professor Stănescu, can you hear me?
Hello.
Yeah, I
Hear
can
me
hear
okay?
you. Yeah, I can see and hear you brilliantly.
Okay.
We're very sorry that you didn't receive emails from us with a Zoom link and other important information earlier. Yeah, we still don't understand what the problem is. We're really sorry for that. So before
No
we
worries.
start, do you have PowerPoint slides?
I do. Yes, I have a.
Yeah,
So let's
I think
see
you
if I
can
can
share
share
it.
it here.
Yeah,
Okay. Did that work?
yeah, we can see them.
Okay, great.
Then let me introduce you. Vasile Stănescu is an associate professor of communication studies, Mercer University. Vasile will give a presentation on the topic slaughterhouse capitalism, animal resistance, effeminate rice eaters, and solidarity is the basis for animal liberation. So the floor is yours, Professor Stănescu.
Hello. Okay. Before I start, just a few things. So before I begin, I first would like to thank and mention John, who just spoke earlier. He is just been on the right side of history countless times, and rather that's in terms of humane meat, which we work to together, rather that's in terms of in vitro meat, which we work to together, rather that's in terms of critique of capitalism that we've worked on together. And I think he hasn't always got the recognition that I think he deserves. And so before I begin, I just want to give a huge shout out to him. And if anyone is looking for people to speak at their conferences or at their graduate schools, I hope you'll reach out to them. There was some back and forth about the presentation today. What I will be presenting on is actually about the environment. The original topic we had a bunch of baloney, animal agriculture, and greenwashing. So let me begin. In 2006, the United Nations came out with a report called Livestock's Long Shadow. In this report, they made a series of claims about the environmental disasters that animal agriculture causes. One of the claims that really stood out to people was that animal agriculture releases more greenhouse gas emissions, GHG emissions, than all forms of transportation combined. So it's planes, trains, automobiles. That's 14%. Animal agriculture is actually 18%. Now, this study that the United Nations did in 2016 actually led to a series of additional studies by academics who are all reaching similar, even larger conclusions. So here's a study that came out in 2018 by Joseph Poore, who is a professor at the University of Oxford. And he likewise came to the conclusion that adopting a vegan diet was better than virtually any other action that an individual could take in order to combat climate change. So, as you can imagine, these growth of data, of peer-reviewed studies, of articles in newspapers and what have you, led to a response by the industry. The animal agriculture industry has become very concerned that people are going to decrease their consumption of meat or stop eating meat or tax meat or regulate meat because of fears around the environment. For example, Git went through a whole series of meat-free days and substantially decreased their meat. So in response to these environmental critiques of the way that meat causes climate change, they've had two big responses. And so the first one is that they have just been paying academics, professors, researchers, doctors, just paying them in order to help influence their research. So for example, this is Frank Mitholiner. He is a PhD at UC Davis. He's not a climatologist in any way, but he receives a large amount of money from the industry, from factory farms, in order to, in essence, distort his own research and to claim to people that meat is not harmful for the environment, and in fact, we need more factory farms. So I don't have a ton of time to go into this first industry response today, but I want to highlight it because there's a growing group of us who are all working together on the project. We're starting to make real difference, and we would love to have you involved. So we're doing regional. So we're working in the United States. I'm starting to work on Canada. But if there's somebody in Russia or in Eastern Europe would also like to talk about the way that there is distortion that is happening, please reach out to me. We have a group that's based out of Brown University, and we're starting to make real progress in bringing awareness to what is going on. So let me highlight. I wrote a chapter about Frank Mitholiner called Cowgate, a peer-reviewed chapter. It came out in 2019. These are a couple of the researchers that I'm working with that have just been phenomenal. So much of the success is really due to both of them. And working together, we had an article that came out in The Guardian that started to awareness about this greenwashing that the industry is doing, the way that they are tricking people into believing harming the environment when in reality they really are. Based in many ways to this excellent work of these other researchers I just mentioned. We had an article come out in the New York Times. We had an article come out in the Washington Post, many other places. And the overarching goal is actually to lead to lawsuits so that we can actually start suing these people who are distorting the research and actually harming the environment. So if any of you would like to work at, graduate students are absolutely invited. And if any of you would like to work on the way that animal agriculture is being greenwashed, particularly in an Eastern European context, please let me know. However, today, what I'd particularly like to focus on is the second strategy that the industry is using, because it is even more devious than the first. The first one, just paying academics to distort their research, is what, you know, the tobacco industry did and the oil industry did, and we can kind of get it. The second strategy is even more devious, and it's factory farms, which are now marketing themselves as sustainable or humane farms. And so you may have heard these terms of free range, organic, pasture-fed, local, etc. I took a look, and we'll come back to it later. Before I did this presentation, this verbiage I found even in multiple farms in Russia that all market themselves that way. And what is happening, here's a few examples in the United States context. So this is Niman Ranch. We'll get back to Niman in a minute. It is the world's largest producer of so-called sustainable meat. Here is one from Chipotle. It is the largest seller of what is supposedly sustainable meat. Meals to cultivate a better world. This is perhaps my favorite. This is an ad in Canada. Canadian beef, now sustainably sourced. So they're literally claiming that every hamburger in McDonald's is now sustainable. And here's what's going on. So in reality, there is no meat that is sustainable, regardless of how it's produced or raised. And we can talk in the questions in more detail if you want of why that is. So even the most pristine, perfect, small-scale, sustainable farm actually causes massive environmental damage. Even if you took all the animals that are in confined animal feeding operations and let them out, it would actually make more environmental damage due to livestock hurting the environment, having to cut down trees, having to kill invasive species, etc. So there is no meat, no matter how it is raised, that can possibly be sustainable. But 15 years ago, when I was first starting to critique humane meat, at least it was a different industry. At least they were different farms. Even though they weren't sustainable, at least there was two different industries, a factory farm system and a so-called sustainable, local, free-range, humane farm system. Now, increasingly, they are one industry. So I'll give you a few examples. Factory farms, this is the key idea. Factory farms and so-called humane or sustainable farms are one industry. The largest one, which I mentioned earlier, is Niman Ranch. Niman Ranch is the largest producer in the world of so-called humane, pasture-raised beef, pork, etc. However, if you go to their website, which talks about the way that these animals are raised, that talks about the environmental benefits, there's a few factors they leave out. One factor is if you go to their history, they leave out that Bill Niman, who along with his wife, Nicolette Niman, actually founded Niman Ranch, was forced out by shareholders who wanted to make more money by decreasing the standard of care that they gave to the animals. And Bill Niman now boycotts Niman Ranch and does not even have the legal right to his own name. So he can't market anything as Niman meat because Niman owns the name Niman. And so he publicly says he condemns the whole company and urges people not to eat Niman Ranch meat because of the way that in reality, the animals are raised. The other big secret that they leave out is that Niman Ranch actually is now owned by Purdue Farms. So Purdue is a massive confined animal feeding operation, a massive CAFO system. It is a factory farm. It is one of the largest factory farms in the world. And what has happened is that they have simply bought Niman Ranch. So Niman Ranch itself is no longer its own company. Niman Ranch as such doesn't really exist. It is just a brand. The factory farm, Purdue Farms, actually owns everything, and then they just have this brand of Niman Ranch that they use to make even more money. So Niman meat is more expensive than the factory farmed meat that Purdue sells. And so they just have two brands where they sell their normal factory farm meat and they sell their Niman Ranch meat, which has as low as standards they can get away with and still legally market it, and they just rake in the money. But if you go to the Purdue website, it will tell you that they own Niman Ranch. But if you go to the Niman Ranch website, no matter how long you look at it, you will never realize, in fact, that it's simply owned by Purdue Farms. Indeed, it is even more insidious than that, because when you look at the environmental claims of Niman Ranch now, even though there's all this verbiage, when you get to and actually read through what it says for them, being environmentally sustainable means making money. It means being economically sustainable. So the only environmental claim that Niman Ranch is doing anymore is just to make more money. Likewise, if you look at the cause of Niman Ranch, it is to help small-scale independent farms, even though in reality, it is owned by Purdue, a factory farm. Obviously, no amount of buying Purdue's products will ever put Purdue out of business. The only thing that will ever happen is that Purdue will get even richer. Indeed, if you go into the frequently asked questions on Niman's own website, and the question is, why should you buy Niman Ranch? It says because factory farms are bad. And this is being done by a factory farm. What is occurring is Purdue is selling its own critique of itself to consumers to make more money. Every company has their own version of this. Every single factory farm out there all has their own version of Niman Ranch, their version of Niman Ranch. So this one is pasture-crafted beef. There's a long video that we could take a look at, that I encourage you to take a look at on your own. It's these farmers that are walking out in the prairie that speak very slow with their hats on, and they say, oh, what is most important to me is taking care of the land. It is all pasture-crafted beef. They're very careful not to say anything you could actually sue them on, because pasture-crafted beef is a wholly owned brand of Cargill. And this is what it actually looks like. It's just a factory farm. As far as anyone has been able to figure out, there is no difference between pasture-crafted beef and any other factory farm beef. What they specifically do is exploit a loophole where in the factory farm system, this is true for all factory farm systems of the way that cows are raised in feedlots, they spend some time feeding on grass before they're brought into the feedlot to fatten themselves out. So they exploit the fact that the cows spend some time on grass to be able to market as pasture crafted since they were ever on pasture. And so they exploit this thing, which is true just for all factory farm meat, to now be able to rebrand itself as beautiful cowboys walking on the land, talking about how much they love nature. Again, it's just a way to make more money. Again, there's no way that buying this is ever going to put factory farms out of system. It will do exactly the opposite. It will just make them richer. This is nature-raised farms. I'm not sure even how nature raises. I'm not sure how the verbs work. Simple food is simply better, but it's also simply factory farms. It's owned by Tyson. And there are some few changes they do. They don't give antibiotics to the chickens. The chickens are technically cage-free. They're given organic feed. So there's some small changes, but they're all still factory farmed. It's factory farmed chicken that is then marketed as somehow it's sustainable, local, etc. There's no way to tell from the website that it's really owned by Tyson. And again, there's no amount of buying nature-raised farms, which is not its own company, It's simply a brand that'll ever put Tyson out of business. It's just a way for Tyson to make more money. This, however, is my favorite. This is Open Prairie Natural Pork. Again, the name of the brand, which is marketed as though it was its company. You can see the little logo right there is Open Prairie Natural Pork. Now, you might imagine that a company which calls itself Open Prairie would raise its animals in open prairie, but you would be wrong. Because if you look on their fact, frequently asked questions, question, is your pork actually raised in open pasture? Answer, no. They say because of the climate and because of predators, is exclusively, all of the pigs are exclusively raised indoors in factory farms. Here is what open prairie natural pork actually looks like. It's a factory farm. It's the same as any other factory farm. They just market itself as now sustainable, organic, what have you. But this is not a prairie. That's what all these companies are doing. And there is no way the consumer can tell at the end when they go to buy the product. You have it in Russia as well. I told you I took a look before I came. So this is prime beef. As far as I can tell, it's one of the top selling beefs in Russia. All the same verbiage I mentioned is throughout these websites. Not only is it supposedly a better quality of meat, it's also supposedly a better way of life for the cows. They're raised in feedlots. The corn, which is not pasture, which is not grass, are fed to the cows, and they claim it makes great marbling. They're actually very proud of it. They have a whole section where they brag about how they use feedlots. Again, if you would like to work on this research in a Russian context or an Eastern European context, please let me know. Please email afterwards. There's special issue volumes that we're working on right now that we would love to have an Eastern European perspective on. I work in the United States and Canada. I'm not focused on Russia. I would love to work with you. Here in the United States, this is, as far as I could tell, there isn't a Chipotle in Russia, but in the United States and internationally is one of the largest fast casual food restaurants. They make burritos. For a while, it was the single richest restaurant of this type, fast food or fast casual, in the world, based on exactly one marketing technique, which is factory farms are bad. So basically 100% of Chipotle's ads were all critiquing factory farms. So I brought you up one, which is the Scarecrow. This is one of their most famous ones. Again, if you haven't had a chance to take a look at it, I urge you to Google and watch it afterwards. The idea is that the Scarecrow, like from the Wizard of Oz, realizes that all of the marketing of how well animals is treated is a lie, and he peeks behind the ad. So literally there's one point where he like pushes an ad aside and peeks behind, and he sees these horribly suffering cows in factory farms, and he's so moved that he opens a Chipotle. And it is the arguably single most effective ad that has ever occurred. The stock for Chipotle through the roof. They got tons of free ads, like people mentioning it on social media, as well as articles that mention that praise them. They came up with a game that you could buy for iPad where you would actually rescue animals from factory farms and you would win a burrito. And the app for this game was the #1 selling app at that time. However, as you might have guessed, as you're starting to see how this goes, Chipotle uses factory farm meat. So even though all they advertise is factory farms are bad, in reality, when you have downloaded this app, freed virtual animals from virtual factory farms, and won a free burrito to Chipotle, the meat you would be eating in that burrito almost definitely would be from a factory farm. And they've confessed this. So this is an article in the New Yorker when they said, hey guys, all you do is advertise factory farms are bad, but your meat overwhelmingly comes from factory farms. To be specific, 100% of their chicken is all factory farmed raised. There's no difference than any other chicken that's raised in factory farmed. The majority of their beef is factory farmed. There's a small amount that comes from Australia, which is certainly not sustainable, but at least it's not factory farmed. The only animals that have any degree of not being factory farmed from Chipotle are the pigs, which are exclusively sourced from Niman Ranch, which we just talked about is actually owned by Purdue. So they were asked about it and they said, we never profess to be perfect and we operate in a gray area. So they just admit that their meat is factory farmed, even though all of their advertising is factory farms are bad. So this is my point, how it's one industry now, rather how it's produced, the farms themselves that make it, or how it's sold. Factory farms and humane meat have now become one industry. So let's take a step back, critical animal studies, and think about how does this have to do with critical theory, critical questions? What is the deeper question going on? We all know the commodity fetish. The woman has the beautiful diamond ring. It seems like the diamond earring, it seems like the diamond earring has appeared from nowhere. In reality, the beauty of the diamond ring hides all the suffering that went into it, all the people that had to mine it and extract it and ship it. That's the traditional commodity fetish. So you can see that with animals too, right? Carol Adams' absent reference, same idea. These animals appear as if by magic, no one knows the suffering that went into it. So have you ever heard this saying, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we'd all be vegan? That's the traditional commodity fetish. Well, what we see is actually something new. Nyman Ranch, which is a brand, doesn't exist, that is actually owned by Purdue Farms. When they say, buy from us because factory farms are bad, that's not the traditional commodity fetish. That's Purdue telling people, hey, factory farms are terrible, and then using it to sell factory farm meat. When Chipotle creates a game where people literally rescue virtual animals from factory farms, that's not the traditional commodity fetish. They're not hiding how terrible factory farms are. They're actually using that to sell factory farm meat. So we see something even worse than the commodity fetish. We see something truly new, which I call the post-commodity fetish, which is that capitalism will sell us anything, even its own critique of its own products. And so what we are now seeing is, and here's the scene I told you about of the scarecrow. That's where he is pushing aside the advertising and peeking in to see how terrible these animals are being treated. What they're actually selling is, hey guys, you know that suffering happens. You know things are being hidden from you. And so we are going to tell you what is being hidden, and you should buy from us to make a difference. But in reality, they're just lying more. In reality, no amount of buying Neiman is ever going to put Purdue out of business. In reality, no amount of buying Chipotle is ever going to get rid of factory farms when they're just selling factory farms. What factory farms are doing, and this is the main takeaway of the whole thing, is they are literally selling us the critique of factory farms themselves. And overwhelmingly, we are buying it. Let me end how I end every talk that I give. If you are doing anything related to animals, thank you. I know how overwhelming what we learn can be. I am overwhelmed and depressed all the time. But the work you're doing could not be more important. It is the most important work in the world. And we are going to keep working together in solidarity until we win. And we are going to win. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Stănescu. Thank you for your interesting and brilliant presentation. So, dear colleagues, are there any questions? As usual, you can ask them aloud or write to the chat. So we have a comment in the chat. Can you see it?
Yes. Is there an interesting point? 100 vegetarian diet. Yes. So the question is about the diet of some of the companies that I mentioned, which are actually owned by factory farms, but claim to be sustainable or helpful. And that is correct. Some of them change the diet to a vegetarian diet. So in most factory farms, even if the animal is an herbivore, so say cows or what have you, certainly chickens, they will feed them meat scraps just because they have so much. And so one minor change they claim is that they're now fed a vegetarian diet. So it is true that some of these companies make minor changes, but they're still all factory farmed. They don't go outside, these sorts of things. So they make whatever minor changes they can to market the product. Sometimes no changes at all, but they don't do anything which is fundamentally different. Let me add, sometimes they'll literally be side by side. And I've gone to these. So they'll have the factory farm over here, let's say the left, and they'll have whatever they're calling the free range organic farm just to the right. And they just do what is minimally necessary to be able to legally market what's to the right. But since obviously they don't care about animals at all, nothing really is ever changing. That's the main takeaway.
So thank you for the answer. Are there any questions?
I have a question. I was trying to raise my hand, but I couldn't find the reaction. How do you feel about buying products that are vegan or plant-based, but they're owned by like the other major factory farm industries or whatever?
Thank you for your question. That is a fantastic question. Not a big fan of it. I'm not a big fan of so-called plant-based instead of vegan products. I was extremely concerned and disheartened when I actually saw vegans come out and argue for Burger King when they came out with the Impossible Whopper. I went to a KFC one time when they came out with their vegan food that everyone was pressing to see what was actually going on. It was right by my house. I could bike to it. And I sat down, and every person that worked there was a Black woman, and they brought their children there with them because they didn't have adequate childcare. And their children were just sitting there in the KFC, and they ordered in pizza. The women that worked there ordered in pizza because the kids were so tired of eating chicken. And the kids sat in the KFC and ate the pizza. And there is not one thing about any of that which was vegan or animal rights or liberatory at all. So it's just masking the kind of problems that are happening, and it's not even helping animals. After KFC got all this publicity for doing a vegan option, they discontinued it. And but while they had it, they achieved record profits, as well as the most positive media attention KFC has ever achieved.
Thank you for the answer, Professor. Are there any questions? Yeah, Jana.
Thank you very much for your insightful presentation. I was wondering whether, just a moment, just a moment. I hear some noises. A moment.
No problem. Take your time. Or you can type the question if you want, if that's easy.
Just a moment, I will type it. Yeah, because.
So then I have a question, if you don't mind, Professor.
Please.
Yeah, we understand that there is a big problem with animal industrial complex and greenwashing of animal agriculture. But what should we do? I mean, quite a large number of people work in animal industrial complex and in animal factories. So how to liberate animals and prevent thousands of people from losing their jobs? Maybe you have a good examples of how this problem was resolved, yeah, or you have any ideas on how this problem could be resolved?
Sure. I mean, so what I believe in is making solidarity with other social justice groups to make real change. The problems we're talking about factory farms, so my particular focus is on the environment and greenwashing, but they have, which is a significant area of solidarity with environmentalists who increasingly care about what's happening to animals, and we can work together. But factory farms and animal agriculture harms everybody. In the United States, no one wants to live around a factory farm. They stink. Everyone around them gets sick. And these are overwhelmingly poor people of color. So if you care about race or social justice in the United States at all, then you have to work together to make a difference. Factory farms have a over 100% turnover a year. I didn't realize that was possible. So that means in a factory farm like Purdue I talked about, every single worker will quit and be replaced every single year because they're just treated so badly. They're just hurt all the time. And no one cares about their injuries. So if you care about workers at all, then you have to make solidarity to change factory farms. No one wants these terrible jobs. So what they do is they recruit undocumented workers in other countries, sneak them into the United States, and keep them in these like houses, which again, I actually have been to, these apartments that the factory farm itself owns, and they dock their pay to pay for the rent and their food and their cable while they work on the factory farms. And so if you care about undocumented workers, you have to care about this. So whatever you care about, what is happening in animal agriculture doesn't just harm the animals, although it does, and that is absolutely important. It harms all of us. And we are just running out of time to make a real difference. And so we have to work together to change things. Okay, here is the earlier question. What justifications of this greenwashing? Do they buy some research to be possible? Do they rely on their understanding of people's compassion? Excellent question. So what the industry says is not that they're buying research, but that they are trying to help. And so they give all this money to these researchers to fund research to figure out how to make meat sustainable. And that phrasing is very key because it assumes it's possible. It also allows them, though, to really control the research by giving this money. And so what they've done is taken a page from the playbook of the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry first pioneered this, where they figured out the best way to convince people that cigarettes weren't addictive, even though they obviously were, wasn't to cut funding, but to massively increase it. And so the tobacco industry just started funding anyone who wanted to research tobacco to be able to shape the research. The fossil fuel industry did exactly the same thing. Literally, sometimes it's the same consultants who are now advising animal agriculture. And so what they do is not cut funding, but massively fund it in order to shape the research. So I talked about Frank Mitholder in the United States. Right now, I'm working on an article called Bullshit about what they're doing in Canada, where we'll give you just one example. If you are a new academic, so you've just got a job, you just got your PhD, you just finished graduate school and you just got your PhD, you can get a mentorship where they will give you money, the industry funds it, they'll give you money to be mentored by two people in the factory farm industry, like someone who owns a factory farm and one of their consultants. And they will fly you out to their conferences, and they will give you additional grant money, and they will give you access to run your experiments or to find out what's happening on their farm. And only the people that agree to this mentorship get that access. There's a video they have where they're like, and now you're part of the family. And the point of that is to shift your research and to guarantee that academics who are doing research friendly to the industry get ahead. If a completely non-biased hiring board, which I've been on, looks at two CVs, and one CV has a researcher who couldn't get any access, couldn't get any funding, couldn't talk at any conferences, couldn't get articles out, and another researcher has grants and funding and conferences and publications and letters from people who've been through this mentorship earlier and say, this is a great guy, who gets the job? So that's the game. If you can't change reality, change the science.
Yes, thank you, Professor, for the answer. Any other questions, guys?
Yeah, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
I
we
can.
can hear.
Thank you very much for this for such an interesting presentation. I'd like to know your opinion. What social changes would have to happen for people to treat nature and animals differently, and to achieve the solidarity you've mentioned?
Great question. I mean, I think solidarity is the change that needs to happen. We keep thinking that we can harm everything else and it won't affect us. And that is silly and untrue. Also, we keep thinking, oh, well, this is something we need to do because we need to be like so compassionate and help them. I'm all for compassion, but that's not persuading people and that's not reality. And we need to realize that everything that we're doing actually is affecting us. And so if we want to save the planet from climate change, if we want to meet the Paris Climate Accords, we have to change how we think about nature, and we have to change how we think about animals, as well as all of the other issues, social issues I talked about before. So we need to be in solidarity with non-human animals, not just out of a sense of compassion, but a sense that we're all in this together. There's only one planet. These little trips to Mars are not going to work out. And the clock is ticking, and we've got to make real difference together. That's what I genuinely believe.
Thank you so much for this answer.
Yeah, Professor Sanbamato.
Thank you. Vasile, I thought that was really, well, it was a terrific presentation and incredibly depressing. I had a couple of questions and comments, and I'm wondering, so three in particular. One is, I think you would agree with me that the irony of this strategy that has been working so well for the industry, the irony is that it's paradoxically a sign of the success of the animal advocacy movement, which made factory farms a household name that we can all be against. And so tell me if you agree that the strategic weakness of that whole approach, right, was to misname the problem, right? It misidentified what the nature of the problem was. And unfortunately, the consequentialism of Peter Singer, his utilitarian ethics, played right into that, right? That it was Peter Singer's animal liberation that became that inspired Alex Pacheco and Ingrid Newkirk to found PETA, the world's largest, most radical, ostensibly pro-animal movement. So that's the first thing, is the irony of that, of the misidentification of the problem. Secondly, I wonder if you see anything positive, as I sort of do, but maybe I'm being too positive, in some of the headway that we've been seeing in mainstream media. People like my friend Marina Bolotnikova, the journalist and editor at Vox. There's a piece, I can't remember the activist name, in Atlantic Monthly that just came out. In other words, is it the case that there have been, are you seeing successful interventions in the I'm talking about the American context, which is the one I know, some pushback that is now getting a little traction because the ecological contradictions are deepening in spite of all this great sustainable crap. Finally, and this one you may not want to answer, but I'm a little skeptical of this idea of post-commodity fetishes, and I'm just wondering if you would agree with me that at the very least what we're seeing, because commodity fetishism by definition is a mystification of the origins of value, right, and production. Isn't it just the case that it's more commodity fetishism, but just with more complex mediations between us and what's actually happening, Anyway, those are the three. Take any or none of those.
Truly brilliant questions. Absolutely fantastic. And I took some notes while you're talking, so I'll just try to go through. So off the first one of it being in a way and a testament to the success of the movement, absolutely. I mean, the critique of factory farms has been so effective. No one defends factory farms, even factory farms. And now they're actually marketing their factory farmed meat as anti-factory farm. But you are also exactly correct that that highlights that the problem was articulating it only as factory farms. And I just saw one of these yesterday from PETA that was like, you think that it's going to be an old McDonald's farm, but really what's going on is the factory farm. Well, the obvious conclusion anyone would draw from that It's not that animals have intrinsic worth or matter, but that we should go back to McDonald's farm. So this misarticulation is partly why we've been less successful. We've actually been successful in making people be worried about factory farms, but we haven't gotten rid of any factory farms, and we certainly haven't helped any animals. So 100% agree. The media, yes. So I mentioned those articles that all recently came out, and there are a slew of others. And you're exactly right. It is this environmental concern that is driving this growing media attention. And if there is a silver lining, that is it. This last week on Wednesday, a publication from Canada, a reporter, an investigative journalist from Canada reached out to me and said, hey, what is going on with greenwashing in Canada? I didn't find him, he found me. And so he is trying to write these articles. And also, you know, I'm in no way a journalist, but journalists need a hook. And so this hook of like, oh, they're lying to you, you know, but here's what's really going on. That's something they can actually like understand, like get their teeth into. And so I believe that a basis around environmental change is one of our strongest rise of making a difference. The third one, post-commodity fetish. I don't overly stress about individual jargon. If anyone doesn't like the term, throw it out. Here's the point. In the scarecrow, when the scarecrow pushes away the ads and sees what's happening to the animal suffering, what he's actually doing is saying, I'm critiquing the commodity fetish. Michael Pollan does the same thing. He says, what's great about local farming is we go beyond the barcode. Well, beyond the barcode is the same term as the commodity fetish, right? We tell you what's really going on. So what they're actually selling is a critique of the commodity fetish. You've been tricked, the scarecrow says. You've been tricked, and you know you've been tricked, and I'm here to help. So of course it's just a mystification. My partner says, you don't need a term, it's just a lie. And I say, yes, weirdly in calm, we have to subdivide the lies. So yes, it is just a lie, but it's a very particular type of lie, which says, you know that these products are tricking you, hence the commodity fetish. And I will now sell you a critique of the trick and yet still trick you. That is what is truly nefarious.
Thank you very much. I just want to say, I think that's one of the most interesting things in your presentation, and yeah, super important. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Professor Stănescu, for the answering. So we still have a time. Maybe someone else want to ask a question.
And if you have questions but you're afraid to speak in English, you can ask these questions in Russian, and me and Mark will try to translate them, or you can type them. So feel free. We understand that it might be scary, but we will try our best to translate your questions.
And also, if just anything I said was unclear, occasionally when I get excited, I speak quickly. And so even if it's just, hey, you know, can you explain this more slowly to an audience that is not fluent in English? It would be my pleasure to make that clear.
I hope, is it possible to hear me? Yeah, sorry. So I have plenty of questions actually, but my question is also how, because I also read your paper on effeminate rice eaters, like the case of this advertisement in Romania, and maybe you could add some points to that, like to the greenwashing, and also this combination of this greenwashing and maybe patriarchy, and how does this advertisement, and I understand these might be completely different topics, but how do they combine together, and maybe this aspiration to this kind of sustainability, to show this is sustainable, is it in connection to other hierarchies and discriminations that can be used by these companies to promote this so-called a sustainable meat, or not from a factory farming meat?
Thank you for the question. So she is referencing an earlier paper that I wrote about a series of advertisements that were done by Burger King in Romania, actually where my family is originally from, Maramureș, Romania, which has traditional style dress. And they claimed the names of these ads were Whopper Virgins, and they claimed to go to people who had never even tasted a Big Mac before for the purest taste test in the world. And of course, it's ridiculous. I mean, there's Burger Kings and McDonald's all through Romania, including in Maramureș, Romania. They would literally had to drive past billboards for them in restaurants in order to film this thing that really just mocked people from Romania, as well as other countries, the Inuit and Asian countries that they also went to. And what was kind of going on, and this is part of this solidarity idea, is that the reason historically that we eat the amount of meat we do and the amount that we do is because of a kind of combination of patriarchy and colonialism and sexism, where when colonialism was happening, the British were like, hey, the reason why we're beating people in India, the reason why we're dominating in Asia, the reason why we've conquered Latin America is because their diet doesn't have enough meat in it. And they had a particular term they used, effeminate rice eaters, although it also applied to people who ate corn. And so their claim was, the reason we're great is because of our diet. The meat makes us strong. The pot roast is what makes us brilliant. It's what makes our brain strong. And so this rhetoric that was prevalent throughout the 19th century, that was endorsed by scientists, medical doctors, which was considered good science at the time, nutritional science, became so embedded that ever since then, we felt the need to constantly consume ever greater amounts of meat to reaffirm our whiteness, our coloniality, and our masculinity, and our Westernness. And so this largely forgotten historical moment, which I try to do all I can to raise awareness about, is part of the way that fights against excessive meat eating are inherently intersectional, and the reason why we eat meat, the problem the factory farm was invented to solve, wasn't calories or taste, but actually this attempt to have white, male, colonialistic privilege personified in meat.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, if it's okay, I think, let me just thank the presenters. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. I have thoroughly enjoyed it. And as I mentioned before, please, if anything I've mentioned today interests you, reach out to me and let's figure out a way to work together.
So yes, thank you very much for the speech and presentation, Professor Stănescu. Yeah, it was really interesting, and we are especially grateful for examples of greenwashing by animal agriculture in Russia. Yeah, and as Professor said, if you know good examples of greenwashing in Russia, you can write to Professor. We can share with you an email, yeah, and you can share information about greenwashing in Russia with Professor. So then let's finish. Thank you for your participation, Professor Stănescu. And once again, we apologize for the difficult email communication. So we was very glad to hear you today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank both of you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.